Welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about part two of America Enters the War. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Italian campaign. We're going to talk about the bombing campaign over Germany, including Dresden. So, we left off in the previous lecture discussing the North African campaign. And so that ends up being successful. Eisenhower for the United States and Montgomery for Great Britain are able to defeat Erwin Rommel in Northern Africa, which means now the Allies have a staging point to be able to invade mainland Europe. Now, Joseph Stalin is not happy with this. He wishes that the attack into mainland Europe would be in France, where Germany would have to commit more troops to defend, thereby relieving pressure on the Soviet Union. Now, it's at this point where FDR and Churchill are getting together to discuss what their next move is going to be. They're actually going to meet at Casablanca in Northern Africa. This is an important symbolic moment because it's the Allies having this big meeting with world leaders in formerly German-held territory. It's really Vichy French, but kind of same thing. And it's going to be at Casablanca, where the Allies are going to establish that only an unconditional surrender of Germany will be acceptable. And so they've laid it out there that Germany's going to have to completely surrender to end this war, or be completely defeated. There will be essentially no terms with Adolf Hitler. He's not going to get to decide, what happens next. They also decide that the next move should be an invasion of Italy and not a cross-channel invasion. The logic is kind of similar. It's just easier to go from North Africa to Sicily and then to Italy. That is going to be less logistically complicated. It's less defended by the Axis powers of Italy and Germany. And so, they're essentially taking the path of least resistance. Stalin's not going to be happy with this. I mean, it is better than nothing for sure, but it's not going to require the amount of attention from Hitler that an invasion of France would have. Churchill's just still not of the opinion that they are ready for a cross-channel invasion. And I'm not sure that he's wrong, but I'm not necessarily convinced that he's completely correct in that assessment. So the first move is going to be an invasion of Sicily. And so Sicily, we can see in the map here, is that tiny island right next to Italy. It looks like the ball that the boot of Italy is kicking, and the Allies jump to Sicily. They're able to do that, I'm going to say, relatively easily. It's all relative. I mean, it's war, and so nothing is extremely easy. And it's when we actually take Sicily that the writing's pretty much on the wall for Italy and for Mussolini. The Italian people are going to turn against Mussolini once the Allies take Sicily. They will depose him, so they're going to get rid of him. They will catch him trying to escape Italy. They're going to beat him to death, and then they're going to display his body for the crowd. So they don't just turn on him; they turn on him, and it's really brutal. It's going to be at this point that the Italians are essentially going to stop fighting the Allies. And so Italy at this point is no longer going to be doing the majority of the fighting in Italy. German forces are going to have to take over the defense of Italy. Hitler is going to double down on Italy because he knows if he just packs up and leaves, that exposes his southern border. And so Hitler's going to draw a pretty hard line in Italy and going to say, nope, the Nazis are going to defend this territory because we would rather fight in Italy than back at home in Germany. And, he knows that Italy is really relatively, I shouldn't say easily defendable, but at the end of the day, the Nazis are going to successfully defend Italy. We won't conquer all of Italy until the end of the war. And so that's in large part because of the geography of Italy. We can see here from the map, and I know my little box here is covering it up, but it's the same map we looked at before. We jump from Sicily to the bottom of the boot in Italy, and then because it's a peninsula, really we've got kind of one route to go, and so we're going to start moving up the peninsula, and there's not a lot of room for strategy here. The Germans kind of know the route that we have to take, and so they're gonna be able to more easily defend that. Then the other thing that the Germans have going for them in northern Italy, you can see in that map, the mountain chain of the Alps, and I mean the Alps are no joke. The altitude in the Alps it's serious, and which makes it very, very difficult to move an army through. And so it's a good place for Hitler to start to defend. And so, in September of 42, the Allies are going to be making advancements up Italy, and those advances, that's going to be hard fought. Italy, in a couple of places in Italy, Salerno, and then later, which we're not really going to talk about, and then later Anzio, are some of the toughest fighting in the entire war. What really is going to happen is they're going to march up until they get to that little black line on the map. That's the Gustav line. And the Germans just dig in there, and the Allies keep attacking, trying to get through the Gustav line. And what they find is that they're really not capable. It's very, very difficult. The defenses are too strong there. And so because Italy is a peninsula, there's actually an opportunity here that to be able to go around the Gustav line. You just have to be able to use your navy to do that, and that's what the Allies are going to do. And they're going to essentially, put a bunch of troops on their ships. They're going to swing around the Gustav line and attack at Anzio. When they attack at Anzio, the battle at Anzio is going to be, it's a target because it's 40 miles south of Rome, right? So it's a good place to be able to land to attack Rome. It's not initially very well defended, I should say. Because the port in Anzio really isn't very deep, and so there's only a few hours a day that you're actually able to dock a ship in Anzio and to be able to unload supplies and soldiers. And so hitting that time perfectly is incredibly difficult. You have to time it with the tide when the water's actually deep enough. And so the Germans, it's really kind of insane to think that there could be any real invasion at Anzio. And so that's why the Americans choose it. It's like, okay, well, if I'm going to attack you where you least expect it, this is a good place. And we actually pull it off. It's absolutely amazing. And so, it's strategic in the sense that nobody really expects attack there. Even though the Germans are there, they are defending it. And it's 40 miles south of Rome. And the idea is if you conquer Rome, then Italy falls because you have the capital. Well, that's a lot of times true when you're invading another country and you're actually fighting that country, but you're not fighting the Italians here, you're fighting the Germans. So to them, Rome is just another city. So it's more of a symbolic thing. But Rome is a major industrial city. And so you want to take that out of the hands of the Germans and out of the hands of German control because they benefit from that. And so the Allies land at Anzio. We're going to see about 4 months of fighting at Anzio. The fighting is so tough, the nickname for Anzio becomes Bloody Anzio. 25,000 Allies there'll be 25,000 Allied casualties, and we're going to see about 30,000 Axis casualties. Sorry, my puppy just walked in the room, and so I got to give her a good pet there. And so this ends up being one of the toughest battles of the war. But eventually we do win at Anzio, regardless of how tough the Germans are fighting. And once we take Anzio, the next step is then Rome. We will liberate Rome by June of 44. So you see it's a couple of years from the time that we invade Italy, southern Italy, to the time we get to Rome. The Germans will not give up after Rome falls. As a matter of fact, they're going to control northern Italy for pretty much the duration of the war. And so, this idea of attacking Germany from the south is not going to come to fruition, at least not with the army. But the important thing that has happened now that Italy is under the control, at least great portions of Italy are under control of the Allies, is now we have military bases that are and Air Force bases that are close enough to bomb Germany itself, right? I mean, technically, we can probably launch attacks and have been launching air attacks from Great Britain into German occupied territory, but flying over enemy territory from Great Britain to Germany is just a logistic nightmare. And so, we're not really effectively able to do that. But once we control Italy, that's a different story. And so now we can start to actually attack Germany itself. And so the Allies start to come up with plans for that, right? And so, that's the next important step. The German Luftwaffe has been attacking the British for quite some time now, essentially since the fall of France, because the Nazis have air bases in France that can hit, London, but, London doesn't have air bases that can easily attack Berlin. And so the air fight has been lopsided. And so once the Italian campaign gets settled in and we have that territory, we start to see actual attacks, air attacks on Germany. Now, like I said, the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, has essentially been dominating the air for most of this war. They are the most advanced Air Force in the world. They have, again, because German society, just like today, German society back then, embraces education more than most European and Western societies, and they embrace technology, more than most Western societies. They're going to have the newest equipment. They're going to embrace that. They're going to have some of the best pilot training because, again, they embrace education. It's a part of daily life. And so, our education system is based on their education system. That's why kindergarten sounds so German. But either way, the Germans have embraced that, and they've been dominating the air. They've been dominating the air in France. That's part of the reason why France fell so quickly. They dominated the air in the Soviet Union on like the first day of Operation Barbarossa when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. They took out about 25% of the Soviet Air Force. So, they're elite. But they failed to defeat the British in Operation Sea Lion. And so with the Battle of Britain, because the British had radar, they were able to strategically use their air force to counter the Luftwaffe's activity. And so the Luftwaffe essentially wasn't able to pull off any surprise attacks. The British were able to scramble their resources and get them into the air. And so that's like softening up the Luftwaffe, right? The Germans only have so many planes, even though they're constantly building more because they do have a rather large industrial capacity, but they only have so many trained pilots. And so, they can't afford to be losing all these pilots. And so now, because of the Eastern campaign, the African campaign, the Battle of Britain, we're seeing the Luftwaffe essentially getting worn out. Now, during the Battle of Britain, we see Hitler starts bombing London. Now, and this is going to be important because the evolution of the carpet bombing, or what we'll call at this time, it's, we talk about carpet bombing in Vietnam, but World War II, we really refer to it as area bombing or saturation bombing. That's going to start to evolve during the Battle of Britain. Now, Hitler, when he's dominating the air, right? I mean, he's at early on in the bombing campaigns and the bombing of London, Hitler makes a very strategic decision. He chooses not to target civilian populations. He wants to target military targets and industrial targets. Now, if you target industrial targets, you will kill civilian workers, but they're civilian workers that are aiding the war effort. And so that's not really considered unusual in war. And he said he initially stays away from civilian targets. He doesn't do that because he's a nice guy. We know he's one of the worst human beings in history. He stays away from civilian targets because he's afraid if he bombs civilians that eventually the Allies will start bombing his civilians. And right now, he's got a ton of support from the German people for all the things he's doing. And he's afraid that that might change if his civilians start getting killed. And so he shies away from that. But as the Battle of Britain is becoming more and more successful for the British, he starts to realize he can't bomb London or these British targets during the day. With the radar and the ability for the pilots to see during the day to attack his planes, he's just losing too many pilots. And so he decides to switch to nighttime bombing. Well, when he decides to switch to nighttime bombing, it's not only harder for the British pilots to see, it's actually also harder for his pilots to see. And so when they start to drop these bombs, they start to actually accidentally bomb civilian targets. Well, the British don't assume that that's an accident, right? They assume that, this is Hitler. He's this evil dude. He's doing it on purpose. And so it's at that point that Winston Churchill starts to, in his mind say, okay, all bets are off. Civilians, even though the British and the Americans will never admit to targeting civilian populations, it's going to happen. And so it's one of those circumstances where war is hell. Like, Hitler never really decided specifically to start bombing civilian populations. It happens essentially from his point of view, it happens out of necessity. And then once he does it, he's like, well, we're just going to continue to do it because, hopefully in his mind, it's going to kill workers, and B, destroy the civilian population's will to fight. Now, neither one of those will work out. We know that today. I mean, modern military historians will tell you the exact opposite thing happens. When you start bombing civilian populations, essentially everything just moves underground. People start, hiding out in basements. Entire industries will move underneath the ground to protect from bombing. And contrary to breaking the will of the civilian people, what happens is you really, once you attack the civilian populations, you push them towards supporting the war more. They say, heck, if you're going to be attacking my wife and my children, that's not going to make me want to fight less. It's going to want to make me fight more. And so we see that the escalation of the bombing really starts happening. Now, as it goes on, the Luftwaffe is just essentially running out of steam. We've already talked about this. The African campaign, the Italian campaign, and the campaign in the Soviet Union have all worn them out. And so by the time we get to the point where we're ready to bomb Germany, Germany's not in the best position to be able to defend against those attacks. And so that's when we really kind of start to let loose use on Germany. Now, at first, we are going to start to target military targets and industrial centers. And so that's what we're trying to do. This is a war of attrition, which means the first side to run out of stuff loses. And so we want to blow up their factories. We want to, destroy their railroads, anything that helps their industrial capacity. And so the Germans will just do what the British did. They're going to start to hide their industry underground. But the Germans also have one other trick they can use. They can start to move industry into the concentration camps. And, he understands that the West just will not be willing to bomb these concentration camps. And so, what they'll do is they'll move a lot of the war making, the factories into these concentration camps, because he knows that we just won't take the risk to bomb them and kill all those innocent civilians. They'll also, to protect trains, paint the tops of trains with markers that say, hey, these are prisoners of war, don't bomb this train. Sometimes that'll work, sometimes it won't work. But it's just one more tool Hitler will use, hiding behind civilian populations. I think all of the evil leaders throughout history have done that. And so the bombing campaigns, they really kind of start out very strategic, and then all of a sudden will start to turn into area bombing or saturation bombing. This strategic building of bombing, like I'm going to blow up this one building, is very difficult to do with the technology back then. We don't have GPS guided missiles like we do today. Today we can take out a specific floor in a building. We have really great targeting, but back then we don't. It was bombing by sight. They actually lined it up, and they had to kind of guess the trajectory. My grandfather actually was a pilot during World War II in the Pacific, and he talked about all the time dropping missiles. You pointed your plane at the thing you wanted to blow up. You essentially unleashed the missile, and then you pulled up and flew away as the missile kind of went on target. Is totally inaccurate. And so what we start to do is we start to see carpet bombing, which is what we call today, or saturation bombing, whereas you just want to drop out a bunch of bombs in the area. These are 4-pound matchstick bombs. Generally speaking, they're incendiary, and so you drop them, they explode, they start a fire, and that burns down the area. Well, this kind of bombing, you can see the bombs coming out of this plane. They're not very targeted, and it's civilian populations will be collateral damage here. You also see 4,000 cookie bombs, and 30-pound incendiaries. That's what you're looking at here, that are more massive, but same general concept. You drop them over the entire area and do as much devastation to the surrounding area as possible. This is, civilians are going to die in this kind of bombing. The Allies will do a little bit better job of, trying to target military targets. Every time we bomb, we're going to announce some sort of military target, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to occasionally target civilian populations. And one great example of that is going to be Dresden. We will, during this war, absolutely decimate Dresden. This is a picture of Dresden here. The unique thing about Dresden is one of those old, very culturally significant German cities. It's a college town, essentially, with just beautiful old architecture. It's not an industrial city. There's no real major war industry here. I'm sure there's probably some, but not at any significant level. and it will be targeted by the Allies. Many people believe, and there is some anecdotal evidence to suggest this, that the bombing of Dresden is going to be at Winston Churchill's behest, as essentially as revenge for the civilian bombings in London. Whether that's true or not, I don't know that we can ever really know for sure. But I mean, there realistically, I kind of believe it. I mean, I think tensions run high, and it is war. Now, um, what but the sad thing about what happens at Dresden is that Dresden, because it doesn't really have any war capabilities, it has become it's become a center for refugees, and refugees have essentially been flocking into Dresden throughout the course of this entire war. They're fleeing from the Soviets that are pushing in from the east, and they're heading there because it's this like cultural center that everybody thinks is safe. And so when the bombs start to fall in Dresden, it's the refugees that are going to pay the price of this. They're even when the bombs fall, and you try and shelter in your basements or wherever you can. These refugees a lot of times are just out on the street, or trying to shelter in doorways, and so it's going to really be devastating when the bombs start falling on Dresden. Hundreds of bombers are going to take off over Dresden. And then Dresden is so poorly defended that when hundreds of these bombers come to attack Dresden, only 6 of them will get shot down. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And it goes to show that the Germans aren't defending Dresden very well. And the reason they're probably not defending it very well is because in their minds, there's nothing significantly contributing to the war effort there, that it doesn't need to be defended. And so, little over 1,400 tons of incendiaries will drop on Dresden. It will essentially create a gigantic inferno, an inferno that's so devastating. Kurt Vonnegut, the famous author, happens to be in Dresden at the time when these bombs are dropped, and he's going to write the book Slaughterhouse 5 about what happens in Dresden and how absolutely devastating it is. And so, it's absolutely creates this gigantic firestorm. The United States helped to facilitate this by bombing the transport lines that are moving in to make sure that the relief and recovery efforts are going to be very much more difficult. And so the bombing takes place. We smash Dresden into oblivion, and so the world really loses this historic and cultural and architectural jewel. We're going to see that there's all kinds of there's all kinds of devastation to the refugee population. The numbers are there's a wide range of numbers for the amount of refugees that die here. And that makes sense because they're refugees. Nobody's really counting them. It's not like as they come in, the mayor of the city's like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, counting the number of people here. But the estimates are somewhere between 35,000 and 135,000 civilian refugees are going to be killed here. The number, honestly, is probably closer to the 135,000. And so, this is just an example of, in World War II, we really think of this war as a war between good guys and bad guys. And I would argue that it is. The Allies are the good guys here, and the Nazis are definitely the bad guys. But that doesn't mean that sometimes the good guys don't do awful things. And the bombing of Dresden is probably one of those things. Now, the Allies will say that Dresden is a communication center, right? There's a lot of communication lines that come in and out of Dresden, and that's not untrue. I don't know that military experts looking at Dresden would tell you today that destroying those communication lines would be worth the amount of civilian deaths that it would take to destroy those lines, right? This is a thing that we as academics and as civilians don't really like to think about, but it is a thing that military commanders have to take into consideration. How valuable is this target towards winning the war versus how many innocent people are going to be killed to destroy the target. That is a thing that the military thinks about and should think about. And so I'm not so sure today that we would make the same decision. I think, which is, at least, some evidence to suggest that this was done in retaliation for the bombings of London. So, kind of a black mark on the Allies' war campaign here. Now, at the end of the day, the devastation in Dresden is awful, but the sustained bombing campaign on Germany is softening Germany up more and more, which is making Churchill and FDR more comfortable to open a second front against the Germans. Now, I hate saying that because we always talk about, the invasion of France at Normandy is opening a second front. That's not accurate. We already have two fronts, right? We've got the Soviet front, we've got the Italian front in the south, and then we'd have a third front in France. And so we're starting to box the Germans in. And that's going to be in large part because of the sustained bombing campaign of Germany. Now, are these saturation bombings, area bombings, are they actually successful? Well, mixed opinion, right? Mixed opinion. In reality, if you say that we want to bomb our enemies to convince their civilian populations not to support the war, there's no evidence that sustained bombing of industry or even civilian populations will cause any decrease in morale or willingness of a country to fight. A lot of times, actually, what we see is the opposite of that, and there's modern evidence for that too. I mean, I think Vietnam is a great example of that. We bombed Vietnam back into the Stone Age. And they kept wanting to fight, and it actually increased their desire to fight. Did it really destroy any industry? Well, not really. I mean, it made industry maybe a little bit slower, and it slowed it down for some time. But most industry just gets hidden or pushed underground, and so we'll see that is that effective? Maybe kind of, but not significantly effective. And in reality, these kind of bombings, because it unites the civilian population against a common enemy, that there's a lot of people that argue that these types of bombings are counterproductive to the war effort. So, what's the answer? Probably somewhere in the middle, right? The idea that you can win a war in the air, we have moved away from that concept, and people really thought during World War II, Hitler thought it with Operation Sea Lion, with this sustained bombing campaign of Germany, the Allies thought it too. We've really come to the conclusion that that doesn't work. But does it help? Probably at least a little bit, but you still need troops on the ground. All right, that's where we will leave off for the day. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you again soon.